So, in response to the requests that the merchants had, Parliament listened. And in February 1766, they repealed the Stamp Act. If that was the cause of the problem, they would just repeal that act. But at the same time, they also passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. It says very plainly that Parliament had the right to tax and make decisions for the British colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonies were property of the King and of Parliament of England. They were not free and independent, so consequently England could do what they wanted to with it. Now, the Townshend Acts was passed shortly after the Declaratory Act, and it tried to avoid many of the problems that the Stamp Act had. For instance, it only applied to imported goods such as glass, tea, paper, and lead. These were items that could not be made in the colonies. So they really nabbed the colonists on this one. They also established a new court system. This court system used money from the taxes that had been paid on these imported goods to pay the governors of the colonies. Now, this really upset many of the colonists because the colonial assemblies, their House of Representatives, had always paid for the governor's wages. So by taking this power away, as you can guess, that makes the governors loyal to the king and to the British government, not to the colonial assemblies and to the colonists. So the colonists are outraged by the taxes that Parliament imposed because only representatives had the right to levy any taxes, and they once again boycotted items that had been taxed in the Townshend Act. This leads us to our next major section, building colonial. Key terms include the coercive acts and the intolerable acts. Well, we have to start with Boston. October 1st, 1768, huge amount of British ships are docked in Boston Harbor. Hundreds of soldiers in red uniforms file out. They marched into the center of the city and set up camp. These redcoats were everywhere. That's what they were called, redcoats, because of their red uniforms. And many colonists felt like this was just too much. First, there was a series of laws that were created to violate their rights, in particular the taxation. And now the British had sent an army to occupy colonial cities. This was simply too much for the colonists to handle. So with all this conflict, tension is growing. And by having these soldiers stationed in Boston, it changes the way of life for the colonists in Boston. The soldiers acted rudely. They were even violent towards the colonists. The colonists are lower leveled people than these British soldiers. The soldiers often stole from shops. They'd get in fights with boys who would tease them on the street. And something that really upset most colonists was that these soldiers only had to work certain hours of the day. Well, then they would go and apply for off-hour jobs, and they didn't have to make any money from it because the king was already paying their living. So they could charge half the cost, if that, of the colonists that needed the job. So it destroyed the economic system. The hatred for soldiers grew every single day until finally it exploded in something known as the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre. It occurs March 5th, 1770. There was a fight between the townspeople and the redcoats. Soldiers fired 7 shots in chaos. It was complete pandemonium. And out of these 7 shots, 5 colonists were killed. Now, it was determined that these people, these soldiers, needed to be brought to trial. Amazingly enough, the American colonists stood up for a trial, and they did not immediately execute these soldiers, but they were represented. They were represented by excellent attorneys, and they were found not guilty. Basically, the colonists, in one way or another, had started the conflict. It came from snowballs being thrown, and it led to the death of 5 colonists. For many, this is considered the beginning of the Revolutionary War. For others, it's not. It's not an actual battle. So it's all in your interpretation. Well, the word spread very quickly about the Boston Massacre, and that's how it was stated, the Boston Massacre. As you saw from the picture on the previous slide, it looks like a massacre. They use this, colonial leaders use this as support. Samuel Adams put up these posters describing the massacre as a slaughter of innocents, and it led to stronger boycotts. Parliament was forced to repeal all the Townshend Acts except the one on tea. So what happens next? Well, you're going to have to tune in to the next PowerPoint presentation. However, for your quiz on this presentation, I would like you to go back to the previous slide and answer the questions in which you analyze the poster that was being put up, the image of the Boston Massacre. That is your quiz for this section.